Unfortunately, there were no answers. Yun. Save the Earth. Global birth stop. For our survival, a worldwide birth stop is urgently needed to protect nature.
A good doctor cures his patient effectively and sustainably by correctly diagnosing the cause of a disease, then fighting the ailment at its root in order to eliminate it as permanently as possible. By eliminating the factor causing the illness, the patient is cured and restored to health. The doctor has done his job correctly and well. However, a doctor who knows the cause of a patient's physical or mental suffering but does nothing about it despite a clear diagnosis is acting negligently, irresponsibly, and ultimately in contempt of humanity because, against his better judgment, he only treats the symptoms of the suffering, thereby making the sick person dependent on himself and enriching himself from his suffering. It is similar with the state of health of our homeworld. We are responsible for the earth, all life existing on it, and the entire nature of this beautiful planet. Our Earth is increasingly suffering from the consequences of overpopulation. The resulting consequences are due to the greenhouse effect caused by increased CO2 emissions. We are now experiencing the devastating effects in the form of climate change, increasing natural disasters, storms, volcanic eruptions, earthquakes, famines, wars, mass migrations, and so on. In the interpersonal sphere, the consequences of overpopulation are evident in the form of a general degeneration of human beings, loss of values, destruction of interpersonal relationships, and many other evils. The rulers, politicians, and other responsible people, which basically includes every single human being, mostly do not act as a responsible thinking and compassionate doctor of the patient Earth. Instead, they continue to only discuss and talk, as most recently at the 2022 World Climate Summit in Sharm el-Sheikh. A wise and responsible parent is concerned about providing a decent life for their children. They are concerned about providing each offspring with enough food, a healthy environment, and a life of harmony, love, peace, and freedom. Parents are aware that they should never produce more children than is responsible and reasonable, in line with the wisdom that too much is unhealthy. The world community, however, acts against all reason and destroys its habitat, food, and environment, and thus human dignity, harmony, peace, and life itself. It disregards the laws of life and nature and drives global overpopulation to ever greater heights. All responsible people must therefore recognize and speak publicly about the fact that the main cause of all great evils on Earth lies in the horrendous global overpopulation, the consequences of which threaten to suffocate human beings, unless they resort to the only causally effective antidote, namely restrictive but humane birth controls that apply worldwide. The obvious cause of all life and environment-destroying effects on Earth, namely the enormous overpopulation by human beings, was also not openly addressed at the past climate conferences, which is why no effective measures in the form of birth controls were also adopted that could still mitigate the consequences of climate change.
A call to action to all rulers, politicians, and all those responsible in all areas of the world.
Human beings, through their environmentally destructive behavior, bear a large share of the blame for the impending scope of the climate catastrophe, which, in the worst case, could hurl the entire humanity back to the Stone Age level in terms of technology and consciousness, or even wipe it out completely. All life is based on the natural law of cause and effect, but human beings, in their stupidity and indifference, do not want to recognize this and do not act accordingly, which could avert a great deal of disaster. What is urgently needed now is a sense of reality, understanding, reason, and consistent action for the good of the environment and for the protection of our planet, which is our home world. The time for action has long since come for those in power, as well as for politicians and those responsible in all areas. Finally, speak publicly about the necessity of worldwide birth regulations and strive to pass and enact laws as soon as possible that will sustainably limit population growth and permanently reduce the world's population. The appeal to all those in positions of responsibility at all levels of power is, in the fight against the impending climate catastrophe, do not strive to simply combat the symptoms of the climate catastrophe, but finally call the root of the evil by its real name, overpopulation, and strive for worldwide and rigorous birth regulations. In fact, only in this way can the worst of the climate catastrophe perhaps still be prevented, if the cause of it is combated, namely worldwide overpopulation.
Reply from a member of the German Bundestag.
Sent. Wednesday, 14th September 2022 at 10:39 HRs from Bystron Peter. Bystron Bundestag? The To Achim Wolf. Subject AW Overpopulation. The root of many evils.
Dear Mr. Wolf, the birth rates in Muslim and African countries, which is almost the same thing, are not discussed anywhere for fear of the Nazi Club. In Western countries, couples have 1 to 3 children, depending on how many one can afford, with only a few exceptions. In the countries mentioned above, women have around 10 children, and in many marriages a man can call 30 children his own with 3 wives. This is all completely insane. The truth must be told in all areas, not just overpopulation. Warmest greetings, Peter Bystron, MP, German Bundestag.
The more human beings, the more damage they will do. Editor 10.9. 2022.
If human beings in India, China, and Africa want to live as hedonistic and consumerist lives as we do, there will be too many human beings.
Growth of populations on all continents. See deposit in photos.
Adieu, Wachstum is the title of a book by social scientist and high school teacher Norbert Nicol. His facts, summarized in 450 pages, allow only one conclusion. The hedonistic and consumption-oriented lifestyle of most human beings in the industrialized countries has no future. With the author's permission, InfoSperber takes over 2 slightly abridged chapters. The first part relentlessly enumerates the sins of civilized humanity. The second part shows the connection between consumption and the number of human beings. It was not until the year 1800, after about 200,000 years since human beings began to spread on Earth, that the number of human beings had reached the magic number of 1 billion. In 1927, just 123 years later, there were 2 billion human beings. It took less than 100 years to reach the 3rd billion in 1960. Further billion stations were the years 1974, 1987, 1999, and 2011. Today, around 7.8 billion human beings populate the planet. According to UN projections, the number of human beings will rise to 8.5 in 2030. By 2050, there will be 9.7 billion human beings, and finally 10.9 billion in 2100.
The increase in world population since the birth of Christ in 0. Before Christ, human beings had lived on Earth for at least 200,000 years. See ResearchGate.
From 1800 to today, the world population has increased almost 8-fold. World energy consumption has increased 27-fold since 1820. Population growth has been very useful for industrial capitalist expansion. Population growth has always been a significant driver of growth in the past.
Exploitation and strain on nature.
Looking at the current situation of global food production, peak oil, peak phosphorus, soil degradation, climate change, and water scarcity pose major challenges. Moreover, given the overfishing of the world's oceans, the protein supply from fisheries has probably already passed its zenith. The food supply sector has increased its yields in a way that is neither sustainable nor can be increased ever further. Inevitably, this is where Thomas Robert Malthus, 1766 to 1834, comes in. Malthus was an Anglican clergyman, social philosopher, and national economist. To this day, he is the best-known population theorist in the world, and certainly also the most controversial. Malthus's population theory appeared in a first edition in 1798. As early as 1741, the German demographer Johann Peter Suschmilch, 1707 to 1767, had published a rather optimistic population theory. There would be room and food for at least 7 billion human beings on Earth. Malthus's assumption that food production would only grow linearly actually proved to be wrong. Malthus argued entirely within the framework of agrarian society and thought within the logic of the traditional solar energy system. But it did not stop there. Fossil fuel-fired industrialization began. Fossil fuels provided enormous amounts of surplus energy. In agriculture, much later, machinery, pesticides, and high-yielding varieties arrived, allowing exponential increases in production. The world population increased. Since the 1980s, another trend reversal has become apparent. The world population is not yet declining, but the speed of its growth is decreasing, so that food production, although growing more slowly, can still keep pace.
Resources are nowhere near sufficient for general consumption at the level of the USA.
Assuming that all human beings on Earth would reach the American level of prosperity expressed in per capita income of 1990 in 50 years, the world's population, despite an assumed increase in efficiency by a factor of 4, would need 11 times the resources and 11 times the functioning natural systems to process the waste of humanity. Neither Malthus nor Johann Peter Suschmilch had foreseen the major ecological problems of the 21st century. These ecological upheavals could one day lead to Malthus being proved right, admittedly in a different way than he thought. Environmental journalist Lothar Mayer notes,
"What is killing us is not only the growth of the population P, but above all, the level of consumption A. Today, the human species is running at high speed into a thoroughly Malthusian jam. That it is constructed a little differently than Malthus predicted does not make it any less deadly."
There is a causal link between population growth and the environmental crisis. It is important to classify this correctly. The starting point is agricultural livestock farming. This contributes significantly to global warming. In the wake of population growth, the emission of greenhouse gases such as carbon dioxide and methane has increased. Methane emissions are a particularly good indicator of the correlation. The greenhouse gas methane is produced by fermentation processes. The main sources of methane emissions are cattle breeding and rice cultivation. cattle breeding, and rice cultivation have increased considerably in recent years because more of the Earth's inhabitants need to be fed. Climate change, partly caused by climate change, has led to an increase in methane emissions. Climate change, partly caused by methane emissions, is in turn having a negative impact on the foundations of the world's food supply. Some of the Earth's most productive agricultural regions are already threatened in their existence by the consequences of global warming, specifically storms, rising sea levels, or desertification.
Extremely different demands on resources.
Every human being needs and consumes natural resources and thus damages the environment. To what extent, however, depends very much on their way of life. The world's population now amounts to 7.8 billion human beings. India is growing the fastest, adding around 15 million new citizens to the world every year. It is followed by China with 6 million, Nigeria with 4 million, and the USA, which contributes 3 million human beings. Those 3 million U.S. citizens, however, live much more resource and energy-intensive lives than the 15 million Indians or the 6 million Chinese. The U.S. state of New York has a population of around 19.3 million. New York consumes more electricity than the 800 million human beings living in sub-Saharan Africa. An average U.S. citizen consumes 34 times as much energy as an average Bangladeshi citizen. This makes it clear the Earth could not ecologically digest more than 2 billion U.S. Americans, but 12 billion Bangladeshis could if they continue to live on average as they do now. A study published in the journal Nature Communications attempted to quantify the environmental damage of the rich. According to this study, the richest tenth of the world's population is responsible for 43% of all environmental damage. In contrast, the poorest tenth of the world's population is responsible for only 5% of all environmental damage. The situation is similar when it comes to emissions. The situation is similar for CO2 emissions. An Oxfam study at the end of 2015 showed that the richest 10% of the world's population caused just under half of all carbon dioxide emissions. In contrast, the poorer half of the world's population is responsible for only 10% of CO2 emissions. 10. Take Germany, for example. Germans emit an average of 10 tons of CO2 per capita per year. In Somalia, the figure is just 100 kilograms. And there are even more drastic figures, as economists Thomas Piketty and Lucas Chancel have shown. The richest 1% of human beings emit an average of around 200 tons of CO2 per person per year. Conversely, the poorest 1% emits only 0.1 tons of CO2 per person per year into the atmosphere. That is 2,000 times less.
Consumption more important than number of human beings.
Studies have shown that the 3 billion human beings in 1961 consumed only 50% of the Earth's total resources. Since the golden 60s, not only has the world's population risen sharply, but also the sense of entitlement and the general standard of living. This is the crux of the matter. For resource consumption, the increase in per capita consumption has been much more decisive than population growth. All empirical data show this. Since 1970, the world's population has more than doubled, but consumption has increased more than tenfold. Even if one chooses an even larger time period, the findings remain clear. Since 1800, the population has increased 7.8-fold. Consumption increased 140-fold over the same period. The inhabitants of rich countries consume many times more natural resources than human beings in poor countries. Their ecological footprint is much larger. In this respect, we should focus much more on the excessive consumption of the rich and the unequal distribution of income and life chances. All this does not mean that the absolute size of the population and population growth are irrelevant. On the contrary, a further increase in the world population makes it more difficult to solve many problems. The population variable has its importance in the long equation of world problems. But it is not population growth alone that is destroying our livelihoods. Many who speak of overpopulation want to give themselves an excuse to do nothing about the great human challenges facing humanity. For if the growing world population is made the main culprit for climate change, environmental pollution, and the destruction of habitats, one is in the clear. Whether consumption and population growth can be separated is highly controversial. The famous biologist Paul Ehrlich has a clear opinion on this. However, to separate the question of consumption and population, he says, is like saying that the length of a rectangle contributes more to its area than its width. For him, the more the human beings have, the more they want. That's why his outlook is bleak. The next 2 billion human beings added will do much greater damage than the last 2 billion. From the publisher's information, Limits to Growth became the environmental book of the 20th century in 1972. Where do we stand today? Norbert Nicole provides a rich, critical account of the capitalist idea of growth. He makes vivid how it has historically come about, how it has made a small section of the privileged rich, and is now leading us into a climate, energy, and resource crisis. In a tour de force, he brings us facts from ecology, economics, sociology, geology, history, and political science. At the same time, he draws approaches for a sustainable and people-friendly metamorphosis of the idea of growth and makes it plausible. Growth and prosperity can and must be decoupled in order to make our planet sustainable.